didn't help her get the case out. They just ignored her. They treated her like dirt. And other cases the other 5 cases that are due up at some point, we'd hoped it would have been this spring. Looks like it's going to be the autumn now. One of those other cases was a child on a beach who was abused by a man who looked strikingly like Christian Brueckner. The family say is Christian Brueckner. And they obviously want to get justice there. Of course, there's the 4 children in the park that were exposed to Christian Brueckner at near midnight. Can you imagine the scare of your child being under in a play park, very dark, near midnight, and a man takes his dick out and whatever? And so they want justice, of course. So eventually we'll hopefully see it, but right the way through, it's been slowed down and slowed down and slowed down, and it's a painstaking process. And I'm very pleased to say that I've got very good access to the police and the judiciary and a lot of the key characters that are in this, and a lot of it's just a sort of slow burn of telling their stories and bringing them together and speaking to them and updating them, and them updating me, and sort of trying to go forwards as best as possible. But I am confident, despite what you may read in the Sun or the Mail or in fact all the papers recently, that the case is now being dropped and that he could be out any minute soon. I'm pretty confident that's not the case.
All right, John, going back to the first few days again then. So the McCanns were criticised for their behaviour in the aftermath. Do you think that criticism is valid, or do you think they were in shock and people behave differently in shock, so there's no real yardstick there as to how to judge people?
They were criticised in lots of ways. In which particular way are you referring to?
Well, they were criticised for not showing enough emotion, for going out jogging and not, joining the search and things like this. Various criticisms have come to light.
I think it's fair to say, Shaun, that everyone acts differently, and you've got a medical couple, one a fairly senior career doctor, one a GP, and who see and live and breathe death on a daily basis, have to stay strong for their patients, have to handle grief and emotion, that it would be fairly normal for them to want to hold it together and to look, perhaps, I'm sure they looked emotional enough to me when I saw that press conference. They certainly showed a lot of emotion. But yeah, I think why would you need someone to break down on TV to think that they actually showed emotion? I think the criticism was unfair. Yeah, there's some conjecture about leaving your kids in a room and supposedly going backwards and forwards, but equally all their friends should also be criticised. And a lot of people did it back then. They don't so much now, do they? And there were some mistakes made. They'd be the first to admit it. And no, I think it's difficult to criticise them. I think that's a side issue, really.
So in these cases, then, the parents are often on the suspect list. What happened with the Portuguese police and the parents?
Yeah, well, I think they were desperate to find some clues and to actually move forwards. And I think, obviously, logically, everyone would always look at the family in a case like this. It's the most obvious thing you would do. And probably 75% of the time you'd be right, and you would actually find, the perpetrator amongst the family or close friends. But so, it's understandable they would bring the family in for questioning. They would pick apart their timelines. And, I just think they were naive to think that there was a group of professional doctors that could have been so deceptive and could have been so, I don't know if it was evil, but certainly completely criminal in plotting to protect their friends, if you like. I think that, to me, it seemed fairly obvious, and I think it's obvious to the British government and certainly Operation Grange that they weren't involved, they weren't guilty from the beginning. So I think that what it lost 2 to 3 months of valuable time when they could have been looking for key clues. So I think it actually scuppered the whole investigation by getting very fixated on the McCanns.
What about the allegation that Madeleine was drugged, the cow paw and all that stuff?
They deny it. They deny it. They said they had used drugs. They said they had them, but they said they hadn't given it to him. And there's no evidence, is there? So, let's just accept it that they didn't drug her.
Why would they have those drugs with them then?
I think everyone used Calpol and things like that, didn't they? Back in the day, I think they still do, to help the kids sleep. Especially if you're a doctor, I think it wouldn't be out of the norm to have certain sleeping drugs or pills. I think it's always a bit of interest in the fact that the two twins, now 18, aren't they? They slept right the way through, apparently, which is amazing. But having had kids of my own, it's amazing, how they can sleep through these sort of things. And once they're asleep, they really are asleep. I'm not a doctor, and I'm not, so I couldn't really comment on that.
All right, so you took us through day one then. What happened on day two?
Gosh, it's 15 years ago, 16 years ago, Shaun. I think I continued to dig on what had sort of going on. I think by end of day two, I think we were starting to be a little bit suspicious of one of the locals, Mr. Murat, who I think he's been exonerated, but I still think he was very suspicious at the time.
What was the suspicion based on?
I think based on his sudden, very deep interest in the case, and the fact that he was very closely linked to the police operation. He was translating a lot for the police. He was bringing a lot of local characters in. He showed a lot of enthusiasm and excitement for the case. Plus, he also coincidentally lived so close and had line of sight of the actual apartment. So I think it would be logical in the way that the police would look at the family. The journalists there would start looking at other people around them as well. So, if you like, that's our job, really, isn't it? As journalists, is to look at all the possibilities and eventualities, which is what I was doing. As you may know, the Sunday Mirror actually did call up the British police in Leicestershire and did report him to the police, who then reported it to the Portuguese police, who then did eventually see fit to arrest Robert Murat. And actually, we didn't run the story first because it was on Sky News and the dailies first. But I think that's, if you like, I think that was fairly responsible reporting, because we were reporting on what we thought was a possibility or good possibility. What else? I think we also pretty quickly discovered this huge number of a kind of unofficial list of suspects. Sorry, suspects is the wrong word. People who would be on a sex offenders list, or a list of people who would be of interest, maybe a better way of putting it, in that area. Now, if you bear in mind it's a tiny village of 2,000 or 3,000 people, to have a list of up to 600 or 600 and a bit over of people of interest, it's quite staggering. That did, by the way, go to Lagos, which is a little bit further away and has a few more people, but it was a very large, long list of people that supposedly, as you know, had Christian Brueckner on it. Supposedly he was visited, but I doubt that happened very much. Particularly because he wasn't actually living at the address supposedly the police had for him at the time. But there were a lot of, so that early on we knew, and we went off to a couple of places that we knew there were various British and German sex offenders. One of being Barrow Saint-Jean, which is about 6 miles away, just outside, and we dug around looking into some of these people and trying to see if there was any, had there been any police interest. Police had been going around, interestingly, knocking on doors and seeing a few people, but nothing came up. So yeah, day 2, day 3, that was the sort of that was this general thing that happened. Then I said I was back in Spain for a few days and came back out again, and it was more digging, and as the case developed.
And what were the police announcing as the case developed?
Very little, incredibly little. I mean, I think one of the most interesting things I found was early on, before, I think I probably the first to establish this, was that the main operation was coming out of Portimao, about 20 minutes, half an hour away. And that's where the headquarters were for that side of the Algarve. And there were probably somewhere like 20 or 30 detectives, mostly plainclothes, who were dragged down from Lisbon, Porto, and all up the coast. And they were sort of there to follow leads. But the undeniable thing was that they were hanging around. I kept going there. They all be hanging around. They were sitting there. They were like bored, and they were just like, we've got leads. We want to get on with stuff, but we're not being sent off. And and they were quite friendly with me. And my Portuguese is relatively limited, but I tried to speak to them in Portuguese, or certainly they speak good English, most of them. And it was quite apparent that there wasn't a whole lot of activity going on. There wasn't enough real chasing stuff, and that might be they didn't have that many leads, didn't have that much. So they seem to have the manpower, but not necessarily the guidance or the leads they needed. Because, as you may know, Shaun, that the cameras, for example, on the motorway driving into Spain weren't working, it turned out, and they shut the border, but it was 24 hours later. And I got pulled over, ironically, 48 hours later, going back, and was grilled, like went through the boot of my car. And I was just like, I'm a journalist covering this story, and you're around looking into my boot and asking me this and that, So there was lots of mistakes, so many mistakes from the beginning. I mean, frightening large amount.
Do you know how long Marat was held for and why he was cleared?
It wasn't. He was made an arguido. I don't think he was held for that long. I'm going to say I think they kept him up very late at night before they questioned him. They made it really uncomfortable for him, and he was cleared. This is quite good. It's quite interesting. I don't even want to really guess. I'm not sure when he was cleared. I'd say in the first few months, fairly early on.
Who was the next person to be questioned?
The McCanns were after that. Well, actually, they questioned his Russian friend Sergei Malinka, and they questioned his Marat's girlfriend Michaela, and they were friends. They went to they were both Jehovah's, and weirdly, they'd actually chatted on the night 3 times, various phone calls between the 3 of them, but they didn't remember the phone calls, which was very odd. Which I always think is very suspicious, but to this day hasn't been explained really properly. Around, not long after Madeleine went missing. I'm not interested in pointing the finger at any of them now, but there's certainly still some as you'll find in the book, some kind of questions that haven't been answered on those specific people.
So you said the McCanns are questioned next, and did they cooperate fully with the police?
I think they did initially. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I'm pretty sure they did. But there were lots of there were claims that they refused to do an ID parade or go out and do a reconstruction. So I think there were things that the Portuguese would say they didn't do and they didn't help with. I think it was in their interest to help and be as honest as possible. I don't think they had any intention of trying to cover anything up.
And did they have high-level connections with the British government for the British government to get so involved?
No, I don't think so. They had a friend who was a journalist, fairly senior. They were able to get calls in to some of the big media networks, and it was fairly clear the story was going to be huge. So I think it was only fair that the British embassy got involved quickly and came down and gave them some moral support, and also, as you can understand, needed some media backing as well, because there was I think it's hard to. I think you'd struggle. You'd be hard pressed to find, Shaun, a case. At least I can't remember there are many cases. Certainly Diana, but I can't think of many cases going back now where you not only had every single tabloid newspaper, but you had every single broadsheet newspaper, and you had every single TV network, radio stations from the UK, that is, but also from Spain, from Portugal, from America, from France, from Germany. So it's unusual to have something that goes right across the board, from the red tops right the way through to the broadsheets. When you find that someone from the Telegraph who was an employee of mine for a couple of years, Fiona, was the Telegraph's correspondent for the Spain and Portugal. When you discover that she spent nearly 3 months living in Pradeluche through that case, you realise